At 1500 on the 20th of September 1944, 3 days into Operation Market Garden, the American paratroopers of the 3rd Battalion, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division, launched an assault crossing of the River Vaal at the city of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Overcoming strong German resistance on the river bank, the men of the 3rd Battalion secured their landing areas, before pushing east and reaching the northern end of the Nijmegen Road Bridge at approximately 19:15. Here, the paratroopers linked up with the British tanks and No. 1 Squadron of the 2nd Battalion, the Grenadier Guards of the Guards Armoured Division, who, just 15 minutes before, at 1900, had stormed across the Nijmegen Road Bridge and captured its northern end. On establishing this link-up, the American troops expected the British tankers to strike north and relieve the beleaguered paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. However, according to the Americans, the British tankers refused to go any further, and instead the men of the Grenadier Guards settled down for the night and brewed tea on the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. Colonel Reuben Tucker, the commander of the American 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, later claimed, "We just stood there seething as the British settled in for the night, failing to take advantage of the situation. We couldn't understand it. It simply wasn't the way we did things in the American army, especially if it had been our guys at Arnhem hanging by their fingernails 11 miles away. We'd have been going, rolling without stop. Instead, they had harboured for the night. As usual, they stopped for tea." Over 50 years have passed since Colonel Tucker made this comment, and in that time many historians and veterans have taken it at face value and believed it to be an indisputable fact. But is this really what happened? Did British troops actually stop for tea and refuse to advance on Arnhem on the night of the 20th of September? If so, what evidence is there to support this claim? Interestingly, there is none, and instead there is ample evidence available in the form of wartime documents and unit histories that prove this allegation to be nothing more than a myth. To truly understand what happened at Nijmegen Bridge that night, we have to go back to the evening of the 19th of September 1944, when the plans for the attack against the road bridge were drawn up. Under these plans, the troops of the 1st Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, and the 2nd Battalion, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, were to attack through central Nijmegen and clear the ground up to the southern end of the road bridge. Throughout this phase of operations, both battalions would be supported by the Sherman tanks of the 2nd Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, which was to have a troop of 4 tanks for No. 1 Squadron in battalion reserve, ready to charge across the road bridge when the opportunity presented itself. In conjunction with this effort, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, with support from the tanks of the 2nd Battalion, the Irish Guards, was to clear the area west of the Nijmegen railway line up to the banks of the River Vaal. Once this was achieved, the 3rd Battalion, the 504th, would mount an assault crossing of the Vaal with a view of capturing the northern end of the road bridge. With this plan in place, the British and American forces began their advance at 0800 on the 20th of September. In the west, the 504th and the Irish Guards experienced little difficulties, and by midday they were established on the southern bank of the Vaal, with H hour for the assault river crossing set for 1500. Meanwhile, in central Nijmegen, the 505th and the Grenadier Guards encountered strong German opposition, and for over 10 hours all 3 battalions were embroiled in fierce close-quarter fighting, as every house and street had to be cleared of the enemy. Eventually, by 1700, the lead British and American troops had forced their way through to the southern end of the road bridge, and were beginning to clear the area of German forces. At around that time, a report was received stating that the 3rd Battalion, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had successfully stormed across the Vaal and had captured the northern end of the bridge. On receipt of this news, the reserve troop of No. 1 Squadron of the 2nd Grenadier Guards was ordered forward and directed to storm across the road bridge and link up with the American paratroopers on the far side. Commanding this troop of 4 Sherman tanks was Sergeant Peter Robinson, who led his small force out of the Allied line just after 1830. Through smoke and small arms fire, the British tanks slowly edged their way forward to the bridge, when suddenly German anti-tank fire began to be received. Immediately, Sergeant Robinson ordered his troop to withdraw into a better position and engage the enemy guns, a task the troops successfully carried out, with the Grenadiers claiming at least one 88mm gun destroyed. In the minutes that followed, Sergeant Robinson and his troop carried out a brief reorganisation before they once again headed out into no man's land and attempted for a second time to storm the bridge. It was now approximately 1900, and for this second attempt, Sergeant Robinson ordered the Sherman commanded by Lance Sergeant Cyril Pacey to lead the way, while he and the other 2 tanks followed up closely behind. The history of the Guards Armoured Division details that. Led by Sergeant Cyril Pacey, the tanks moved forward again, firing all the time. To the astonishment of all onlookers and listeners on the wireless, the 4 tanks drove swiftly onto the bridge and gradually disappeared into the gloom. Germans were firing from every possible vantage point, including the topmost girders, whence, as they were hit, they fell to their beloved river far below. Even the wireless operator of the leading tank killed at least 1 German with his pistol out of the port hole, while the tank commander, Sergeant Pacey, fired his Bren gun from the front. This tank continued its dash straight across the bridge and steered through one of the 2 narrow gaps in the concrete wall built across the northern approaches, coming to a stop a short distance beyond. It was quickly joined by Sergeant Robinson. Through a hail of enemy fire, the Sherman tanks of Sergeant Robinson and Lance Sergeant Pacey successfully crossed the 600-metre-long Nijmegen road bridge and reached the northern end. Unfortunately though, the other 2 tanks in the troop, commanded by Lance Sergeant Jack Billingham and Sergeant Milton Knight, were hit by German Panzerfaust fire and were unable to reach the far side. On bailing out of their tanks, all but 1 of the British crewmen were taken as prisoners of war, with Sergeant Milton Knight the only one to evade capture as he played dead a short distance from his tank. After a while, the sergeant got up, realised that his Sherman was still in working order, and so drove it to the northern end, where he rejoined the rest of his troop later that night. In the meantime, having crossed the bridge, Sergeants Robinson and Pacey rolled down the northern ramp and surprised 2 German anti-tank guns that were positioned on the roadside. The 2 Shermans then continued on into the village of Lent, where it quickly became clear that the area was swarming with German troops and was not in American hands. It later transpired that the report received from the 3rd Battalion, the 504th, stating that they had secured the northern end of the bridge, was in reference to the nearby railway bridge and not the road bridge. Nevertheless, despite being the only Allied troops in the area at that time and receiving heavy enemy fire, the 2 British tanks decided to press on through Lent, with Sergeant Robinson's Sherman knocking out a German self-propelled gun, which was located outside the village church. The 2 tanks then passed under a small railway bridge, where their advance was brought to a halt by 2 German anti-tank guns, both of which fired on and narrowly missed the British tanks. At this point, Sergeant Robinson realised he could go no further, and so he ordered his and Lance Sergeant Pacey's tank to withdraw and consolidate their positions just north of Lent. It was here, at approximately 19:15 on the 20th of September, that first contact was made with a group of American paratroopers from the 3rd Battalion, the 504th, with Sergeant Peter Robinson later recalling, "I saw these helmets duck in a ditch and run and gave them a burst of machine gun. I suddenly realised they were Americans. They had already thrown a gammon grenade at me, so dust and dirt and smoke was flying everywhere. Suddenly, there were Americans swarming all over the tank, hugging and kissing me, even kissing the tank." Meanwhile, a kilometre back down the road at the Nijmegen Bridge, another Sherman tank crossed over to reinforce Sergeant Robinson's troop. This tank was commanded by Captain Peter Carrington, the second in command of No. 1 Squadron of the 2nd Grenadier Guards. On crossing over, Captain Carrington found that small parties of enemy infantry had deployed back onto the northern end of the bridge, thus isolating Sergeant Robinson's troop to the north. Realising this, the captain and his tank crew single-handedly engaged these enemy troops, and eventually regained complete control over the northern end. For this action, Captain Peter Carrington will later be awarded the Military Cross, the citation for which states, "This officer, on his own initiative, crossed the bridge in his tank and engaged the enemy, driving them off, and remained holding the far side of the bridge until relieved by another tank. By his devotion to duty and initiative, this officer was undoubtedly instrumental in control being retained of the northern approaches to the bridge at a very vital time." After a while, a few more tanks from the 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed over the bridge and took over responsibility for guarding its northern end. This then enabled Captain Carrington to link up with Sergeant Robinson, who briefed the captain on the situation and informed him that the Germans had deployed an anti-tank screen a few hundred meters up the road. On learning of this, Captain Carrington issued orders for Sergeant Robinson's troop to take up a defensive position and await the arrival of reinforcements. Given the situation at that time, this was the only option available to the captain, as there was only 3 British tanks deployed forward, Lent was still under German control, and the enemy strength opposite Sergeant Robinson's troop was unknown. On top of this, local civilians reported that the Germans were preparing to launch an immediate counterattack to retake the Nijmegen Bridge, and it thus became Captain Carrington's responsibility as the senior British commander in the area to ensure that the Allied bridgehead was held at all costs. There was also the issue that Sergeant Robinson's troop was running low on ammunition, whilst pockets of German infantry were still holding out in central Nijmegen, and until these were dealt with, the centre line into the bridgehead was under continued threat. With all these factors considered, Captain Carrington was left with no choice but to order Sergeant Robinson to hold his position. No further advance towards Arnhem could take place until the situation had improved. However, despite these facts, Captain Carrington's orders to Sergeant Robinson had become the subject of controversy, with veterans of the American 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment accusing the British tank crews of refusing to advance on Arnhem and instead stopping for tea, whilst military historians claim that an advance on Arnhem on the night of the 20th of September could have been carried out, as there was no German forces capable of stopping Sergeant Robinson's troop. For the past 80 years, these two arguments have frequently been brought up when discussing the battle for Nijmegen, but, interestingly, neither stand up to scrutiny. For starters, there is not a single piece of evidence in wartime reports or post-war unit histories to back up the American claim that the Grenadier Guards refused to advance on Arnhem and instead stopped for tea. As mentioned at the start of this video, Colonel Reuben Tucker, the commander of the 504th, was one of the first to make this allegation, and since his comments were made public, other American paratroopers have come forward making similar claims, among them Captain Moffat Boris. That's when the British tank crews brought out their teapots. I was furious. I charged to the front of the tank line where I found the British commander, Captain Peter Carrington. "Why are you stopping?" I asked him. "I can't proceed," he said crisply. "That gun will knock out my tanks." I said, "We will go with you, we can knock out that gun." He replied with, "I can't go on without orders." He was a British captain and I was an American captain. He wasn't about to recognise my authority. I cocked my Tommy gun, put it up to his head and said, "You get this tank moving or I'll blow your damn head off." With that, he ducked into his tank and locked the hatch. Captain Carrington was later informed of Captain Boris's comments and responded with the following. "My recollection of this meeting is different. I certainly met an American officer, but he was perfectly affable and agreeable. As I said, the Airborne were all very glad to see us and get some support. No one suggested we should press on to Arnhem." This whole allegation is bizarre. Just to begin with, I was a captain and second in command of my squadron, so I was in no position either to take orders from another captain or depart from my own orders, which were to take my tanks across the bridge, join up with the US Airborne, and form a bridgehead. This story is simply lunacy, and this alleged exchange did not take place. Although the exact details of this meeting are disputed, one thing that can be confirmed is that the British tank crews did not bring out their teapots. This allegation is refuted by the wartime reports of the Grenadier Guards, the 504th Regiment, the 82nd Airborne, the Guards Armoured, 30 Corps, the 1st Airborne Corps, 2nd Army, and the 21st Army Group, all of which state that Sergeant Peter Robinson's troops spent the night of the 20th of September engaged in sporadic fighting against small groups of German infantry, and was awaiting the start of the rumoured German counterattack. A report from Headquarters 21st Army Group reads, "By 2015 hours, a close bridgehead was firmly established. Far into the night, sporadic fighting continued on both banks of the Vaal, and also on the bridge itself, where snipers were still firing from the girders." The post-war histories of the Grenadier Guards and the Guards Armoured Division corroborate the wartime reports, with the latter stating that the isolated little force in Lent disposed itself to the best advantage pending the arrival of reinforcements. Throughout the hours of darkness, sporadic fighting continued on both banks of the Vaal, and it was a nerve-wracking and uncomfortable night for all members of the small force holding the bridgehead. Many civilians came in with rumours of impending counterattacks. Next is the claim by military historians that Sergeant Robinson's troop could have easily advanced on Arnhem on the night of the 20th of September, as the road north from Lent was clear of German forces. In his book, Sons of the Reich, Michael Reynolds states the following: "There was virtually nothing to stop an advance up the Arnhem Road. Once again, however, British caution ruled the day." In his book, It Never Snows in September, Robert Kershaw states, "As the first Sherman tanks surged into Lent, the road ahead was open. All that stood in the way of 30 Corps in Arnhem during much of the night of the 20th, 21st of September were a few security pickets." Once again, the facts tell a completely different story. Although the British were unsure at the time about the strength of the enemy north of Lent, post-war research proves that the road to Arnhem was not open, and that an advance by just 2 Sherman tanks at night and along a single raised road would have not only been very difficult, but also suicidal. Firstly, Sergeant Robinson's troop would have had to have cleared the 2 anti-tank guns that they had encountered at the small railway bridge just outside of Lent. After this, the troop would have faced another German position at the village of Ressen, which, according to the US official history, consisted of an SS battalion reinforced with 11 tanks, another infantry battalion, 2 batteries of 88mm guns, 20 20mm anti-aircraft guns, and survivors of earlier fighting in Nijmegen. Added to this were an additional 5 tanks from the 10th SS Panzer Regiment in the vicinity of Bemmel, and an artillery battery reinforced with infantry at Oosterhout. There was also 3 artillery batteries in position between Vlieren and Pannerden, whilst an intelligence report received at 19:30 on the 20th of September by the headquarters of the 82nd Airborne Division states that the Germans were moving 3 Tiger tanks, 2 companies of infantry, and heavy artillery from the southeast of Arnhem to the Lent area. Assuming Sergeant Robinson's 2 tanks somehow broke through these German forces, they would have then bumped into elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division in Arnhem itself. In short, contrary to popular belief, the road between Arnhem and Nijmegen on the night of the 20th of September 1944 was blocked by a substantial German force, and it is baffling as to why historians have for decades pushed out the narrative that the road was clear, and that Sergeant Robinson's 2 tanks could have easily rolled on through and reached Arnhem. Captain Andrew Gibson Watt, who served with the Welsh Guards throughout the war, concludes that "My own complaint is the acceptance of the thesis that the Guards Armoured Division should have gone on to Arnhem on the night they captured the Nijmegen Bridge. The division, off balance and still heavily embroiled in Nijmegen town, could not have done so. There was nothing to go with. The main preoccupation was now to defend the Nijmegen Bridge against the expected counterattack. Any element which had gone on would have found it very hard to get over the Arnhem Bridge, and if it had got over, would have been met by the greatly superior German forces in that part of Arnhem. An advance that night was not on, and general military historians have erred greatly in assuming that it would have been possible and should have been done. It is time for this accusation, which does not stand up to detailed examination, to be finally refuted. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe so that you never miss one of my future videos.